And I'll continue letting folks in as they arrive. Welcome,
Oh,
everyone.
all
Good
right.
afternoon.
Hi. Well, I'm going to get started. Um, so, welcome to this listening session. It's one of many that we need to have as a field. And as we look towards, are we doing the best for our kids in the communities that we've chosen to serve in? And, I think the chaos that we're currently experiencing in our country and quite frankly around the world has really informed the need of these conversations, but not just the conversations, also action behind every conversation. I'm not a big believer in having discussions and not taking action as a result of those discussions. I think it's disrespectful to your time, to our time, and to our children who need us desperately and are waiting for us to shift the lanes and shift the perspective. So that's a big part of why we decided to have this conversation today. Um, it's really an opportunity for everyone to hold some space to share experiences, to talk about concerns. I know that there are many of you here who have concerns about what your work looks like, and are there missteps that you may have taken? Are there things that could have been done differently? Is there something in job descriptions and curriculum that maybe needs to be retooled or checked by somebody else? And so this is an opportunity for you to hear and listen and share. This will also be an opportunity to share thoughts or questions of El Sistema USA. What kinds of things do you need from us, and how can we as an organization best support our member organizations across the country as really we go through this process of dismantling some of the unspoken behaviors that have occurred over the last couple of centuries. And then you're going to be able to share what you need from us. And my hope is that you sharing your needs will help us inform the processes that we already have in place and the plans that have already been happening in the organization. And so we're going to have an opportunity to hear from Christine Taylor-Conda, our board chair for the board of directors, our CEO and president, Katie Wyatt Vandermeer, and Monique Van Willen and Hillary Hardy. I hope I'm remembering everybody's last name. I could be making all this stuff up. And Dr. Armand Hall, and our consultant, Dr. Raja Staggers Hakim, who's also a really amazing friend of mine. And I'm honored to be doing this work with her. I've learned so much from her in our short time of friendship. I think we've been friends for now like 4 or 5 years, but she's my sister in this work. And so I'm really looking forward to us unpacking, peeling back the layers of the onion, and then doing the hard work of admitting the faults and then creating the infrastructure and the foundation to be better. So I am passing the baton to Christine.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to see so many faces as I scroll through. It's hard not being able to be together with everyone in person, but as I'm learning from these meetings, the online platform actually can give folks an opportunity in some ways to have more of an equal voice. So I want to encourage you all as we go through this, and Kalita and Raja lead us, I want to encourage you to have courage. I don't want to tell you not to have fear. There's a pop song on the radio right now. It says, be afraid, be very afraid, but do it anyway. So that's what we're going to have to do today. You can use your chat function. I know that's more comfortable for some people. You can raise your hand. You can just speak out. It's just the time for all voices to be heard. It's just so important. In my own organization, and I love my own organization, our statement of support for Black Lives Matter came out a couple days ago. If it had if I had not spoken up last week in the crafting of the statement, there would be nothing in the statement about anti-racism training. I was nervous. It is a largely white organization. I spoke out and not out, just up. It's a loving organization. We're not fighting. But in speaking up, it was just a reminder. And folks got on the bandwagon, and anti-racism training now can't start soon enough for the whole organization. When are we doing it? Tomorrow? So everybody's voice is very important. As the chair of El Sistema USA, I want to say that I couldn't ask for a better family. I found my people when I discovered the El Sistema inspired clan. I just found, you know, we share all the time. We're a culture of learning from each other in a system and an organization, El Sistema, that none of us are that familiar with. We're becoming familiar with it as we learn from each other. So we have that going for each other. As far as I've seen so far with the El Sistema inspired community, that grain of competitiveness is not in there yet. It's really more like a whole loaf of collaboration and learning, and that's what we're going to do in this case as well. I have hosted in my own organization in the last 7 days 5 listening sessions with our instructors and students and families. They have been enlightening, they have been cathartic, they have been emotional, they have triggered in me memories of acts of racism that have happened to me. I've been a blessed and sheltered person, but still things have happened and they come up now and the feelings come up. And it's been wonderful that we've been able to embrace each other, even though it's digitally, as these emotions come to light because of the learning that is behind those emotions. It's really been fantastic. And to feel the trust that we have with each other as we share our experiences. The final thing I'm going to say is that El Sistema USA as an organization does not have it right, and we do not have all of the answers. But what we are going to do with the community, members, non-members, is share our journey as we go along. We are not years ahead of other organizations. We're not even days ahead. We're maybe 20 minutes ahead in some respects and far behind in others. One of the learnings for us was in crafting our own statement. It was very collaborative, and that was one of the lessons that we learned. Katie sent it out to the whole board, and we had a lot of back and forth and sharing, and it was made stronger from that. I will let you know that the board is going to engage in our own cultural, racial diversity and anti-racism training starting next week, led and facilitated by Raja Staggers Hakim. And so we're not far. Why didn't we do this already? We've been talking about it. So, but as we move forward in this journey, and I'm very hopeful about it, we're going to continue to share with the larger community what our steps are, what our missteps are, and what our enlightenment is going to be as we move forward. This is going to make us stronger. This is going to make us more empathetic to every single child that we work with and their families and their communities. And this is going to bring us together in love. And I don't say that in a hokey way. It's the only way that we're going to move forward. So thanks everyone. And I am going to turn this over to Dr. Raja Staggers Hakim to introduce herself. And then Khalida and Raja will take it away.
Thank you, Christine. I'm Dr. Raja Staggers Hakim, and as Christine mentioned, I'll be working with El Sistema. Actually, I have started working with El Sistema over the past month or so in preparation for DEI training that will occur the later part of this month. My background is that I'm a social researcher, specifically a sociologist in the study of health in society, so health and illness behavior, and as well as race, class, and gender. I've taught in higher education over the last 15 years, and I also am very much focused on studying racism and health outcomes. So this work is important because as we talk about, as I think about and I do research in racism and health outcomes, it's very important in terms of looking at how social institutions work with communities. And how in some ways, whether they do this intentionally or unintentionally, they continue to engage in practices that can affect communities adversely. So I'm excited about this work today. I realize that so many organizations have, there's an awareness that's there in terms of organizations participating in this level of work. I'm grateful that El Sistema is taking this step, and it speaks a lot to the commitment for this work. So I look forward to the session today, to learning from you all, and from continuing this practice with El Sistema.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Raja. We look forward to working with you and Kalida. And I just want to take this time to lift up our Executive Director, Katie Wyatt, and ask her to make some remarks. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to echo and support the comments of my colleagues and friends and emphasize why we're hosting this session. I especially want to emphasize that we are open to being vulnerable to learning about what our blind spots are. I also am open to learning what my personal blind spots might be so that we can make improvements and better support our Black and Brown students, families, instructors, and colleagues. I came to the work of El Sistema because of a transforming personal experience in Venezuela, where I saw firsthand the incredible talent and potential of hundreds of thousands of young people whose voices could now be heard. They were singing and playing out loud, and they captured the attention of the world. Their voices have power. The work and the vision of El Sistema is rooted in this power, which is the power of music to build communities. Communities are strongest when all voices have power, are heard, and have the ability to shift, change, and learn over time. The majority of the families and children that we work with are Black and Brown. We serve more than 20,000 young people, and we know that these young people are 41% Latinx and 26% Black. There are two largest groups. This fact alone highlights our imperative that we must push for racial equity both in and through the work that we are doing, and that through our organizations, we have the power to engage our communities in a call to action. As others have shared, El Sistema USA is on its own path as an organization, and I am on my own personal path as a white person towards understanding and dismantling systems of white supremacy. We know and embrace the responsibility that El Sistema USA must be a strong leader in this. Where we are fortunate is that we have the special power of music and the arts to change minds and change lives towards social and racial justice through inspiration and through the beauty of creativity and music itself. El Sistema, as conceived, is our framework for inclusivity. Following today's listening session, we'll be sharing our current activities and resources available that are focused on equity and social justice, and we'll discuss how we want to respond to and move on ideas that come from today's session. Thank you so much for joining us, for your time and your honesty and vulnerability, and for your feedback. Thank you. I want to turn it over to my colleagues Kalida and Raja to begin our discussion.
Great. So thank you, Katie. So we're going to move forward with introducing Hillary and Monique, who are going to speak a bit about what they've been doing with the Equity-Centered Pedagogy Working Group that El Sistema USA has had in place for quite some time now, which is great. It's a great starting point, and it should inform the practices that you may already have in place or should be considering putting into place immediately before the new fiscal year. Change them budgets. Get a new line item in there. This is the time. While people are feeling everything, let those feelings inform action. So Monique and Hillary, feel free to share what the work that you all have been doing.
Thank you so much, Kalita. My name's Hillary Harder. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm from Elkhart County, Indiana. And I'm very, very honored to work with Monique as co-facilitators of the Equity-Centered Pedagogy Working Group. So originally, the working group began as a forum, a chance for El Sistema-inspired teaching artists and program administrators to come together in conversation. And the big idea that drove us to come together is that, as Katie mentioned, El Sistema started in Venezuela. And here in the US, we are adapting El Sistema, this philosophy, to the context of our country with a history of systemic racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, and other intersections of power and privilege. Our El Sistema-inspired programs exist at those intersections. So we feel that this makes it imperative for our field to be exploring topics like identity, intersectionality, and equity, and how they relate to pedagogy and the work that we're doing every day with students and families. So the Equity-Centered Pedagogy Working Group, the mission of our work is, in order to promote holistic child development, we need teacher development that provides space to consider social emotional learning, culturally responsive pedagogy, supporting all learners, and striving for musical excellence. The focus of our group will be to curate experiences and conversations centered around this, with the explicit goal of developing conversations, toolkits, and resources to assist teaching artists in El Sistema-inspired programs. Our working group consists of a leadership committee, which is Monique and myself, Cecile Elliott, Christy Gray, Holly Shagbisen, Ben Ede, Danielle Williams, and Katie Wyatt. We curate 6 sessions a year, which involves presentations of content, group discussions, and guest speakers. And all are welcome to join us. Feel free to visit the El Sistema USA website to find out more. And I'd like to turn it over to Monique now to share more.
Thank you so much, Hillary. Hillary, welcome everyone. My name is Monique van Wille. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm, it's an honor to be on the board of El Sistema USA. And I'm actually gonna just quickly talk about 3 things. I think the first thing I wanted to share is that El Sistema USA has been hard at work at developing a new strategic plan over the last year, since last July. And I just want to share that a core element of that strategic plan right now and some of the goals that we are working around is equity. So looking at how equity, how this plays out, for example, at board level, what this looks like in our programs. So from board to program, all the way down to our classrooms. And so we really have been grappling with the notion of equity, and where we sort of landed with this at this point is that our work is really at the intersection of equity, equitable practices, culturally and sustaining pedagogy. Maybe now we're moving sort of into abolitionist pedagogy. So our work is really at the center of equity and musical excellence. And so this is something that we're going to be sort of going after over the next year, just to expand what that looks like and what that means for us. So we invite, we invite your feedback, and we invite you to join the journey. And then in relation to the equity-centered working group, we will be developing a task force that will sort of come out of the equity-centered working group. And we really hope that this will involve many of you. This might have 1 or 2 components where we really look at the practice of teaching. And maybe this might look like building anti-racist curriculum. Or this might look like looking at what is already out there as sort of anti-racist resources or intersectional resources, and how do we pull those into the music classrooms? And how do we as teachers and leaders get ready to engage with those things? So that's something to look forward to. And if you feel like you have the bandwidth and this is something that might be exciting to you, then please reach out to Hillary or me or Katie to join us. And it is a time, it is a time of action. We cannot afford to go ahead with business as usual. This is not a season where business as usual is a thing, linked to the Black Liberation Movement, also COVID-19. And it is a time that we need to take responsibility. And of course, we know this is collective responsibility, but also individual responsibility to do the work. I've got to do the work. Monique has got to do my work. We've all got to do our own work in our own arena. And this is incredibly important as this field. And so finally, I just wanted to say two things. I think moving forward, that we've got to look at how we center the voices of color in all of our work. This is not something that we are used to doing, and it's not something that always maybe feels comfortable to all, but how do we center the voices of color? This is a huge exploration for us. And the second thing that I just wanted to end off saying, that I want to acknowledge all of those who've gone through pain and anger and frustration and sleepless nights and all sorts of things over the last few weeks linked to the death of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. We got to say their names, and everyone else who's consequently been killed even after that, just in the last week around the country. And so I want to acknowledge those lives who've been lost in this country and those murders. And I also want to acknowledge all of you and everything that you might have been through over the last 2 weeks. And we stand in solidarity with you. This is not an easy process, but we stand in solidarity with each other. And this is the point of today, is that we're gonna create solutions, and we are here to listen. We want to make change and we want to improve. So thank you for joining.
Thank you, Monique. I'm going to turn the floor back over to Christine for one moment, and then following Christine, we will hear from Dr. Armin Hall, who is also one of our Board of Directors members, to speak, and then we will start the conversation.
Thank you, Khalida. I'm sorry, folks, I wanted to say one more thing as we're getting into this. In the listening sessions that I've hosted at our own organization, I asked the following questions, and I thought it might be a good idea for you all to think of these questions as the conversation goes along. Our listening sessions with our families and kids focus not only on racism and its ill effects on us now, the terrible impact it's having, but also on the coronavirus and being sheltered in place for so long. We just wanted to do a general check-in with everybody to see how you all were doing. We certainly want to do that today with you all when you are in the conversation. So my three questions were, what are your sources of strength? What are you hopeful for? And what are your words of wisdom? And everybody has words of wisdom, whether they come from good experiences or bad experiences, whether they come from places of insight or places of ignorance that have changed to insight. So those are the three questions I'd love for us to mull about as we are going through this. Thanks so much, Khalida.
Armin, go for it.
Wonderful. Well, I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I'm very thankful. And part of the reason that I accepted the invitation to speak as one of the Black members on the Board of Directors for El Sistema USA, I tell you that we ourselves are personally working on doing this work and finding out ourselves and who we are as a board right now so that we can produce a better organization for all of you. And we're really interested, and I'm committed to staying there to make sure that that work is happening. And this was a very interesting thing to get ready for, because as a Black man in the United States, or just quite frankly, the world, everything that I do is scrutinized, and it might just be in my head that I'm scrutinized. But I live with this daily sort of, who am I representing when I speak out loud? And so I tell you here today, I'm representing myself, but I'm also representing my parents who were children of the civil rights era here in the United States, and my grandparents who went through the most overt racism that we know now. And I'm representing my two children who unfortunately I've come to grips with, that I know that they won't live in this world without racism that maybe I pretended to believe might happen in the late 90s. And I live in a position of privilege. I have an okay job, and I'm able to provide for them. And so I think about the children in my program and all of your programs who also share that same sense of, at times, it feels like hopelessness. And I want you to know that all of the anguish that people are feeling right now, and the fact that all of the allies, you're so involved, this anguish is a daily anguish for a lot of people. And so please don't be alarmed when your arrival to the party, as I've heard people explaining it, is not met with joy, because it's just like, yeah, this is a reality. But what we have to do is we have to, I think about the children that we impact. And we're all trained musicians, and we are trying to give our best to these children. And I think for everyone to ask why. Why do we believe that music is the thing that's going to help them, and how is it going to help them? And getting at the crux of that, and then looking at who your community is. I moved to Rochester to take over the Rock Music Collaborative program. So excited to be here, but my status as a Black man in the United States does not give me any of the answers for what this community needs. And so I have to do more and more listening so that they can tell me what they want for their children and what this community needs and how it's going to happen. And the thing that I guess I'm thankful for is that I have an empathy. And I think that's what we all have to try to develop. I could understand Me Too. I'm not a woman, but I know what it feels like to be discriminated against and to be treated differently, and to have these things happen that people may or may not believe, and they may be in my head. So with that empathy, I was able to understand and support Me Too. Same thing for my LGBTQ brothers and sisters, being there in support of them. We have to find the empathy in which we understand to sort of, and all that does is open the door for you then to be there with your children. And the fact that you're working on the Suzuki thing, like, it doesn't mean anything to them in terms of the music and how great it is, but what is it about them that has brought them to this instrument, and how can you take them to the next level, employing them with skills that allow them to create music for themselves? I believe that that's what we're here to do. And so I ask you all in earnesty to find those areas of empathy and seek them out. And it is not comfortable to sort of address what you may or may not know. And that's okay, because we can't know everything, but you must know that there is no silver bullet to this. It's not going away anytime soon. So what can we do for those people in our community? And I do believe that if we help the people in our community and we're collectively working towards this, that over time it will get better. I ask you to search for diversity, even at the exclusion of yourself possibly, because what these children need to see is a visual hope of what is next. I worked in an amazing program on the board of directors for the Prism Ensemble in Memphis, Tennessee, and we were very specific about hiring a staff, our board, everything matched the demographics of our community. And that's hard because it is exclusionary, but it is for the children to set them up so that they can see that everyone can work together for their benefit. So I promise you the board is here. I am here if I can ever be of any support, but all I do is have a path forward. There are no answers. So please just stop searching for them and get to being there for the people in your community. And I promise you it'll be very rewarding. And I'm looking forward to being on this path with you all. So thank you for being here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Armin, for sharing your perspective as a Black man, as a musician, as an artist, as a leader, as a change maker. So Katie, little plot twist. I think the best way to do this is we can show the pre-submitted question for just a moment and then stop the share of the screen so that people can kind of see one another if their screens are on. And Raja, do you want to jump in here with me so we can begin?
Sure. I'll go ahead and I'll start reading the first question. And there may be a way though too. I think that's a great idea if that works for you, Katie. If folks are having a difficult time, seeing the speaker, just please let us know. I think there were a couple of comments that came through indicating so. But I again want to echo that. But too, thank you for the remarks from the board. Those were really, I think, everything you said, I think was just important in terms of the personal experience, the personal investment, the organizational investment in this work. And I just feel like those comments are right on, because people are at different levels with understanding racism, whether it be personal experiencing over the course of their, or others becoming aware of it. And it means different things for different people. But at the end of the day, we're all trying to be human, and really to exist, and to recognize and to see the humanity in one another. And I think that we need to keep that at the front and backs of our minds. So what we have first, we'll start with some pre-submitted questions, and Khalid and I will go back and forth, and then we're going to open it up to an interactive session so that we can hear from you today in terms of the concerns and questions that you have. So this very first question is starts with why Duke? When it costs money and has been inconsistently problematic when in its treatment of Durham, and is named for a family that made money off of exploited Black labor and tobacco, but have never investigated if NCCU, North Carolina Central University, and HBCU is interested in partnering with us. So for some of these questions, we're going to tag team a bit. Katie, I want to turn this one over to you, if that's okay. Would you like to begin addressing this?
Definitely. Thank you, Raja, and thank you for the question. To give everyone a bit of background, El Sistema USA has partnered with Duke University in an incubation period. So I think first important to know, this is not a permanent partnership and has been part of our startup effort in the first couple of years, which really started in 2016, of El Sistema USA having a staff as an independent nonprofit separate from the New England Conservatory. So why Duke? Duke engaged with El Sistema USA as a research partner through a grant funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. And then through my work as the founder of Kids Notes in Durham and as a resident of Durham, I have partnered with both North Carolina Central, and also all of the Raleigh-Durham area is rich in universities, and that includes historically Black colleges, so also St. Augustine's and Shaw University in Raleigh. All three institutions have a really strong music education department, and we've partnered with music education students both to support the national conferences that El Sistema USA holds in Durham. And so that's been a great source of partnership already with the local HBCUs and other colleges. And what I think the question speaks to really is the question of partnerships. And we certainly are engaging with Duke as a partner in our startup years, and want to expand our partnerships across the country with institutions that really focus their efforts into lifting up the voices and education and futures of people of color. And that's something we're committed to doing. And Khalida can speak more to just how we might engage in those partnerships in the future. I just want to answer the final piece of this question, is when it costs money. We are not paying Duke for anything. In fact, we receive about $60,000 in-kind support from the university. And that has been a great benefit to us in our startup years.
I just wanted to tag onto that because this is an understanding that I didn't have about the partnership with Duke until I visited last year. It's not a partnership with the monolithic Duke. It's a partnership with a couple of very key departments at Duke that have been very beneficial to El Sistema USA and to the movement. So the research component is very big there, and then obviously the music education component. But it's not a kind of big contractual partnership with the entire university. So I like that. When I understood that, even the board felt more comfortable, because it's a relationship of us utilizing the best resources at hand. So I like to think of it as we have a couple of different partnerships with Duke departments, but we are in no way married to Duke.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I think and the clarification is so important when we talk about what partnerships and relationships are looking like. And quite frankly, I think now we're kind of in a pivot moment where we have time and effort to start doing more due diligence to really engage our historically Black colleges and universities, and the services that they may have that we just don't know about, and also what kind of opening that would have for our students that are participating in our member organizations programming, which could turn into scholarships for them to attend college there, or to attend electives and summer programming at a discounted rate, or sponsored by El Sistema USA. Like, I think there's just a number of ways that we can start engaging with different legs of different institutions in Durham, which doesn't mean we have to stay in Durham, but there's options, and we can be more proactive about our options. And now we're going to do that, which is great.
Yeah. I've been reminded to mention our partnership with Sphinx. So Afa Dworkin is a former board member of El Sistema USA, and we partnered 2 years ago to host a joint conference in Detroit with the Sphinx organization, which was an excellent partnership. That partnership continues with discounts back and forth to our conferences, and we imagine that partnership will continue to grow into the future. I also want to congratulate John Brown, African-American double bassist, who has just been named the new Vice Provost for the Arts at Duke University. He's a longtime Durham resident, really excited about his work, and he's a new leader of the arts at the university.
Okay, great. We can advance to the next slide, please. Okay, and again, I think we have 3 or 4 pre-submitted questions that we're going to take a look at. I'll read this one, Kalita, and we can kind of go back and forth and then open it up. So what is the best way to teach and promote African-American Latin music, African-American Latin and music of other oppressed people without appropriating? And if anyone on the line, thank you. If anyone on the line actually submitted this question, I apologize. I just had to condense it a little bit for our slide here. And I'll just read it again. So the best way to teach and promote African-American Latin and music of other oppressed people without appropriating. And I think that to start this question, we probably want to take a look at, we want to take a look at appropriating and how we're understanding appropriation. I think do we have a slide shift? Okay, so how we're actually examining appropriation. So let's start from a sociological perspective, how we're defining appropriation, and specifically cultural appropriation. So cultural appropriation, I think most people are pretty familiar with, is the idea of taking on and adopting traditional practices, objects, and images of another culture that are separate from the culture that one might belong to. And what happens is that this is often done without permission. If we're talking about, once again, about cultural appropriation. And in that process, when it's done without permission, there's also this component where there's the erasure of the contribution of people from oppressed cultures, which further marginalizes those populations and further oppresses groups that are already experiencing oppression. So in this way, what we see happening is that cultural appropriation can recreate larger systems of structural inequality. So I want to start with that concept, though, too, because I think that sometimes it gets confusing when we, as instructors, people begin to integrate music and other aspects of difference in other cultures as somehow being appropriating when it's actually an introduction, and it can be, and there are opportunities for it to be a celebration. So I want to kind of start with that. Kalita, do you want to speak specifically to teaching um, diverse music and music of different cultures, and then I can kind of piggyback with you.
Sure. I'm really glad that you gave that definition of appropriation, because I think people use a lot of words but don't have the full understanding or the meaning of what it means, and what part they play in that, which can look different for everyone, right? So the first thing is we should be celebrating other cultures, period. Like, it should always be a celebration. It cannot be this feeling of resistance or discomfort within yourself, because that means it's internal work that needs to happen. It doesn't really have anything to do with the music as much as it has to do with who you are and how much learning you're doing on your own before you start interacting with students that maybe you don't understand the lived experiences or the cultural experiences that they've had. So there has to be space for celebrating the culture, the music, the style of music, and that's not appropriation. I think the larger problem derives from not necessarily giving the credit to the artist and the culture, right? Because there may be some discomfort with how it sounds, with that backbeat. It doesn't feel proper because there's all these definitions of proper and what music's supposed to sound like and who's supposed to be playing it and writing it. And that's just not it, folks. Like, we have all kinds of music. I purposely make sure that I'm listening to all kinds. I had to wait till I left my father's house because he was very strict and I could not listen to anything but gospel and whatever was for my violin. But trust and believe, when I left, I got myself engaged in all kinds of music so that I could learn a respect of that. So I encourage you, if you're only exclusively listening to classical music, break that exclusivity, because it's there should be no reason for the words elitist and sophistication to be around classical music. But somebody said that to me recently in 2020, within the last 2 weeks, that it's sophisticated and elitist and it should stay that way. That's not true. That's not how we get down. And we, as member organizations of El Sistema USA, and as leaders in this work, we have to dispel that myth. And there's people carrying that. So if we're celebrating the cultures, if we're recognizing the importance of the contributions, it should leave out that idea that you think you're culturally appropriating. Now, when you start mocking stuff, that's appropriation. Like, get your life together, please, because that's a problem. When you start to mock it, when you make fun of it, when you start to pigeonhole the style, the genre, the textures, the melody, the characters, then there's some discomfort and there's some real intentional work that has to happen on the back end. So if you haven't been exposed to music outside of your comfort zone, expose yourself, because I think the lack of exposure is the biggest problem, and people not being appropriately taught about different cultures is the larger problem, and why individuals are so uncomfortable when I want to do mashups or when I want to talk about taking music from Selma, from the movie Selma, and letting our kids work with it and figure out how to create something around that. And then I look at teachers and they looking at me like, no, this is uncomfortable for me. I can't do this. You need to, if you're going to do this work, if you're making the choice to get involved in this world, then you got to do the work on the back end so that you can be the best person you need to be for our kids.
Okay, thank you, Kalita. And Kalita, I think that you touched on this, and I don't want to, I think you and I talked about this in conversation and what this can mean in terms of training of educators. And I think that this probably comes up in later questions, and maybe folks do have questions about this at some point, in terms of appropriately teaching music of different cultures. So, and I think it also really alludes to the need in terms of, cultural responsiveness in education, and really that being a part of the curriculum that educators are receiving, and particularly educators in music, and how to do that effectively so that you're centering. And I think that's the key piece, though, too. You're centering the music and people of those cultures without viewing it as, on the periphery and as possibly spectacle, but you're really capturing the moment, you're capturing the heritage, and you're honoring the contribution. And that's a celebration. That is in no way appropriation.
Yes, and also it speaks to a much greater challenge, which is how music education is taught in grammar school, and how to teach music in higher ed institutions, because there are very specific lanes that you have to stay in when you're at a higher institution, especially when they're giving you coins, when they're giving you money. This is the lane you're going to have to go down. This is how you're going to teach it. And then you come out and you're like, but I really want to serve my community. You get in said community and you're like, wait, I'm not prepared for this. I can't do this. I wasn't taught this in college. So there's obviously so many layers to how you teach and promote, but it starts with that internal work. Like, you have to decide that you're going to do the work first, and then you're going to hold other people accountable within the organizations that you're working with or for to start making that happen.
Absolutely. Katie, can we advance to the next slide? And I have to make sure that I can see. Okay, here we are. Okay. Okay, wonderful. So our next pre-submitted question reads, I'm a white woman who leads an El Sistema inspired organization. What practical steps can we take to begin the process of uncovering systemic racism within our organization in a way that fundamentally includes the voices of teachers of color? And I feel like this was a pretty heavy question. Kalita, do you want to take the lead on this one, starting this particular one, and then I'll kind of piggyback off of you?
Yeah. So the first step is putting a line item in your budget to address the systemic racism. So that means putting a line item in your budget to do intentional professional development, where you actually bring people in to help you walk through the process of dismantling the white supremacy principles that are already inherently built in to music education in this country. So there has to be some real conversations of discomfort and addressing that and saying it out loud, hearing it, feeling that, and then rebuilding the structure and the foundation of the organization. So if you're already running an organization, the bottom line is, if you don't have people, Black and brown people, in the leadership roles, not much is going to change, because we have been clawing. We started with soft knocking, and then we're like, hi, oh, lived experiences. Oh, I think I know what's going on. Okay, so we're way past that at this point, because the elephant in the room is that everybody saw George Floyd die. Everybody heard about Breonna Taylor. Everybody saw Ahmaud. I did not watch those videos because they're incredibly triggering, and I have a lot of Black men in my life to think about every day. So those videos, for me, it was like, okay, so why should we change now? So I fully believe that you have to put the money and then the action behind that money into really serving our kids. And if you have people in your organization that experience feelings of discomfort or triggers when you start talking about Black and brown challenges and lived experiences, then you're not really ready to take on our kids and their families as a responsibility. When you agree to teach in organizations and in communities that have untapped potential, but you're uncomfortable talking about the elephants in the room, you shouldn't be around those children. And I'm saying this as a woman that plans to have children. That's a dangerous space to be in. And I have to say it out loud. Like, if you can't get around that so that you can be a better educator, a better role model, a better leader, then I don't know what to tell you about how to be better at that. You have to look at your vision, your mission, your curriculum structure. Does your curriculum have space for the Black and brown children that you're serving? Is there space for their music? Is there space for all kinds of music? Is there space for their parents to be a part of the conversation, to have a seat at the table? Is there space for any of that? And if there's not, or if you're not willing to move money around to address it, these are wasted conversations. I know that for Raja and I, and Raja can speak more to this, when we work with different organizations, we look at job descriptions. And the reason that, and I'm not going to speak for all Black and brown people, but we don't typically run for certain jobs, because the first thing we do is check and see who's working there. And if I'm about to be the only one jumping in that pool, I'm not doing it. I did it once. I don't ever need to do it again, ever in my whole entire life, for the rest of my life. So there's things that you have to look at, and I'll turn it over to Raja so she can speak more to that. But we look at very specific things to help you address how to be better for your community.
Absolutely, Kalita. And I think that, you know, in our training, we do similar work, but also different things as well. We did, you know, process this a little bit. I think about, particularly this question looks at, again, addressing systemic racism and how to do that. And I think it is really important that an organization bring in someone from the outside. I mean, I think just to be able to hold a mirror and to encourage an organization to be brave and to be bold in this work. I mean, some of the things that will have to be examined will be just certain structures in place. I mean, you're looking at, you know, your policies, looking at the procedures, you know, do you have an equity statement? Looking at, so there are different levels, you know, strategic planning, right? You know, so where does equity fall into your broader strategic plan, and how is it going to be integrated across all levels of the organization, from the board through the programmatic work? And then we do have to talk, because we're talking about systems, right? So we have to look at those structures, and it's critical that those structures are there, the value statement, that your organization speaks to valuing equity, valuing diversity. And I have to emphasize though too, I mean, we're seeing a lot of these statements though too. So it's one thing to say it, and we have to then begin to be able to feel it, to live it, and to act it. Okay, and I think that, you know, starting with the statement, that helps a lot, because that is the doctrine that we have to say that this is what we're living up to, this is what we're living into, and this is what we're asking of ourselves and for people who are working for the organization, people who are working with the organization, our partners, etc. And this is what we're telling our constituents, that this is what we're providing to them. And I think that that's critical. But just as well, we don't want to forget that we are working with people, and that we are people, and that we do have to look at those interpersonal relationships within organizations. So by having those structures, and really for the organization doing that larger work, then there's an opportunity to hold employees, to hold people accountable for meeting that standard, because we are still dealing with a lot of interpersonal dynamics that happen, so we can't lose track of that. So the staff professional development work is critical, and training staff, you know, really doing a deep dive into racism, and that interpersonal racism work as well is critical, because people can, again, have these blind spots, and that, especially for the work that you're doing, that is going to directly impact the children. It's going to come through the curriculum. It's going to come through how you engage the community, and how you value or don't value the people who are there before you.
Just one more thing for that. The other question that many organizations should be asking themselves is, why are your Black and brown teachers silent? Are they silent, or are they silenced? And there's a very big difference with that. You know, if there's a hierarchical structure that's inadvertently oppressing your teaching artists, they're not going to talk. We know how to turn stuff off and just keep things moving. But I have very little energy at this point, or emotional bandwidth, to question my validity as an artist and as an educator. But you have to think about, am I part of the problem? Like, am I not allowing enough space for some of my Black and brown teaching artists to actually express and share their thoughts and ideas for how we're teaching and how we're learning? And there's a lot of great resources out there. And I've heard this over the last several weeks, which is why I'm going to say it. I've heard a lot of people, and just keeping it honest and transparent for 2020, it's been a lot of our white educators and counterparts who are like, you know, some of these books are just so negative. Y'all, this is not a party, okay? Like, we're talking about looking at education and how it does not necessarily serve Black and brown children in a way where they can learn and understand. And because this wasn't necessarily built for us. It really should have been built alongside, but it wasn't. So we're trying to get a whole generation of children to conform into a world that feels very weird and uncomfortable, and it's exhausting, and it actually doesn't address injustice. It puts a little Band-Aid on it. It puts a little peroxide on it, and then you slap a Band-Aid on, and we just keep trucking. And so I encourage you, especially music educators that are just coming out of school now, You know, look at some books by Bettina Love. I know there's a lot of books out there by her, and she talks about dismantling what the classroom looks like. And it doesn't feel great, but these are not feel great moments because it's not about you. It's about our kids. And the moment you can decenter yourself from the conversation and put all of the focus on those voices that we should be elevating and empowering, the sooner that our conversations can turn to much more important priorities.
Well, thank you, Kalita.
I just wanted to mention that I believe there's a growing list of resources, right, Katie, on the El Sistema USA website for some of the things that Raja and Kalita have just mentioned in terms of finding consultants to work with in your area of the country. Or via digital, I guess you could work with anybody, which is wonderful. Also resources on literature, film, etc., to really educate yourselves. And I include myself in this too. And all the Black people on the call, we're all educating ourselves as well as to the historic origins of racism in the United States, of the manifestation in different institutions. So we may know about the music world, but do we know that much about public school education, or do we know that much about health systems, or obviously the police institution? There's so many different institutions to read about and learn about how systemic racism manifests itself. And so we'll be continuing to populate the website with resources. My one piece of advice too is to make sure that the consultant you're going to work with has some time where they talk about, and when we open the discussion, we'll talk about this, microaggressions. Right now we're focusing on people being murdered on screen in front of us. But what are those little razor slices day in, day out that affect Black people and really have an impact on our children as we're moving forward?
Also, to what Christine said, I just want to put this out there. For organizations that are on this call, it's not 100% your job to do this. There's that human element that Dr. Staggers-Hakeem talked about. It is your personal responsibility as a human and a citizen of the United States of America to do your own work on this. And I would encourage some of our leaders in this work, look at your interview process. You might want to toss a few questions in there about, so what have you been working on? Like, what books are you reading? Just get a temperature read of who you're hiring. Like, are you hiring people that are like, well, I'm not good enough to perform, so I guess I'll teach. If you're hiring them, that's a red flag. Like, you need to know who's jumping into the pond with you to work with our kids. And if they're not really checking themselves and just looking at literature outside of the music, then you may want to go with someone else, and that's not a bad thing.
Thank you, Christine and Kalita. I feel like I want to jump on here, but I know that we have other questions too. I think that this is also important. And, you know, I often say though too, that when we talk about, you know, race and racism, that race work is human rights work. And we do all have an obligation, personal, and as global world citizens to do this work. I'm going to see here, my screen's back up. Okay, great. We're going to go to the next question. And I think that this question will probably allow us to kind of elaborate more on what we previously discussed. And I think after this, we probably have one additional pre-submitted question before we open it up to the floor. And I just want to, a couple of things are moving at the same time. I know that I'm quite sure that there are questions that people are placing into the chat. So we are going to go back to try and capture some of those questions. Ian's on the line as well, though, too, to help us to look at some of those questions so that we're going to try not to miss those as well as people are submitting. So our third or fourth question here is, I was recently told that playing and teaching jazz and the connection it has to current and past civil rights movements, as well as influence on all popular music, would not be a contribution to the current movement and is not anti-racist, but entertainment. And I have to admit, I read this question and I had, you know, an immediate response, and then I read it probably 2 or 3 more times, and I looked at it 2 or 3 different ways. Okay, so I think that it's an interesting question. And at first, you know, I thought my immediate response was, why can't it be both? Right. And why can't, and I think for any artist, there is a part of art that is entertainment, but art can also be a platform for social protest. And it has been. And I think that, you know, even as folks who are on the line are thinking about, and I think this question even speaks to that. And I for myself, as a sociologist, I've had to question myself time and time again, what is my work in this moment? And I think that's something that each of us need to ask. But I do believe, and I think that Christine, you mentioned this, and I was trying not to kind of jump out of my seat here, is that there's work for all of us at this time. And I think that we all have to think about what that work looks like. And right where you are, there is work to do. So I feel like in this question, that part of it actually speaks to the idea that, you know, the work that I'm thinking that I want to do may not be enough. But then there's also this piece about the reach and the utility of jazz music. So back to the idea, why can't it be both? So I think that, you know, we go back to looking at music as it's just art, right? And even the idea of it being so, there's still beauty, and there's work, and there's contribution there. So we want to be thinking about this and looking at this, of course, as, you know, an avenue of expression for both social protest, but then also to emphasize the importance of jazz music as a form of protest and activism, as it had been historically. And in a case like this, though, too, I think that it goes back to the original question about how the work is centered. Is the work and is the contribution of this music centered on the artist and the lived experiences of artists at a particular point in time? So if you think about the work of Louis Armstrong or Billie Holiday or Nina Simone's work, or whether Mississippi Goddam or Strange Fruit, or Black and Blue, what is the context of that music? What are the artists saying? What are they conveying? What are they speaking about in terms of that social moment? And I think that there's education there. There's education there in terms of how people, how students, how young people and artists can use their work to advance social protest, to tell a story, and to share the lived experiences of people. I think that, you know, of course, there's another level to this as well that we have to speak to, you know, in terms of music being a place of joy for people, even a place of escape, and how it can be joy, and joy in and of itself can be revolutionary. So I think that that's another piece that we have to talk about. But I think it's also important, you know, when a question like this is posed, to look at how it had been used in the past, and to even, you know, transform and move that conversation and teaching to show young people how it can continuously be moved to help advance social struggle and protest. Kalita, I want to see if you want to jump in here, because I can go on. Did you want to?
No, I feel like you wrapped it up in a nice bow. And whoever asked you that question, if you're on this call, I mean, you might need to make some new friends. That's all I'm gonna say about it, because it's not productive to go down some of these rabbit holes about contribution versus entertainment. But like, at the end of the day, the music is valid. The music is largely from lived experiences of a lot of the artists and the composers of the music. And I think giving honor to it is so crucial and so important. And it's important for our kids to learn that. And it's important for our adults who are, there are a lot of adults who are explicitly classically trained musicians only. And that's a whole problem in itself. So we have to go ahead and dead that. And I think that all classical musicians, myself included, should also have an education in jazz history and jazz understanding, but also jazz studies should also have an education in classical, because one can't inform the other if we're not aware and we're not listening and we're not experiencing the different genres and styles of learning and music.
One thing that I want to point out, because I don't know whether or not it underlies part of this question. When I was at NEC as a student, the students, all students had to take a music theory exam, and then jazz students had to take a a harder music theory exam, because the music theory underpinnings of jazz are more complex than the music theory underpinnings of classical music, which are in and of themselves quite complex. And I really think that a lot of people don't realize that, because you hear the improvisation in performance, but don't realize the theoretical background that that these musicians need to have in order to make this kind of music. And I think it's important for us to point that out as musicians, music historians, music educators. The level of rigor, the intensity that one has to go through to be a proficient jazz musician, it's extraordinary.
Okay, Kitty, can we advance to the next question? I'm actually, one sec. Armin, did you have a question? I see that your mic, or a comment, you see that your mic was.
Oh, sorry. Nope. Nope.
Anyways,
Got excited.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I did condense this question a bit, though, too. So there may be some pieces that are out of context. And for this one, I think that Kuda, we're going to kind of tag team this one. This was the last a submission that came in towards the end, so we had less time to process it. And I will probably have to give you a little more background, because I did remove some parts of this. So one of our organizational goals is to increase teacher diversity. However, when going through the hiring process, we constantly find ourselves with a pool of applicants who are mostly white. How can we break this cycle? How do we approach diversity personnel decisions while supporting our students, both musically and with representation? And I think that, and I know, Kalita, you read the full question, part of this question was also that they would need to be letting go of some of their teaching faculty. And there was a little bit of concern, because the writer indicates that some of the best faculty are, or at least the current faculty, they had a number of highly competent white faculty members. And it did speak to the idea that they were not able to find a diverse candidate pool that was also qualified in some ways, if I might. Does that sound like it capture that appropriately, Kalita?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
I'm just rereading. I'm looking at the full body of the question. Yeah, that's exactly what was said. Yeah. So then the question becomes, right, what are you willing to sacrifice? Right? So what are the priorities of your organization? Is it the kids? Is it their education? Is it the people that surrounds them and make them feel safe and validated and visible when the adults around them often feel invisible? You know, I almost pose more questions to the questions that we already have.
Absolutely. You know, and I think about this, though, too. I think about how organizations sometimes don't, because of the, and I'm going to go back, though, too, and I'm going to, I think about that question previously that that spoke to the systemic racism, how to address the systemic racism and what would need to happen. I think that if we were to link these two questions, I would even say that because of systemic racism and the pervasiveness, that organizations may not be, and leaders in organizations may not be appropriately trained to recognize the value of diverse candidates. And I think that that may be, I wanted to say it's a skill that people may actually need to be able to recognize the value in the diversity, because the people may be viewing it from a very narrow lens. And they miss, I mean, on one hand, in terms of the impact with the students, but also what people are actually bringing. And I'm not limiting this to simply race or culture. And these are huge values, right? We want to talk about culture being a huge value. That's important. That's critical. But I think that because of that narrow lens, it's not, organizations are not, they may be looking for one thing, and they may need to, again, I go back to the training, may need skills to understand how they can realign, their broader goals and to be able to identify the appropriate characteristics, therefore expanding their reach. The other piece though too, and this is again, not just a challenge in education, it's not just a challenge with musical classical artists, it's a challenge that I hear this question, and I say a challenge, it's challenging for me personally when I hear questions that allude to not having enough, but I know I'm in higher ed, and the president of the college where I teach has said several times that it's difficult to secure faculty of color who have doctorates, and I know at least 20, 30 people of color with doctorates, and I just wonder where people are looking, and I think once again a matter of aligning and really for people to be able to redirect and to show the value and not viewing systems that are outside of traditional Western systems as second class or unvaluable, and I think that has to happen. So I want to make sure that we're getting to the heart of this question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Roger, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say also, when you're looking at your hiring process, there has to be some space to understand that a lot of the hiring processes that are in place anyway right now have largely been in place to keep Black and brown people in a certain category. So the lack of transparency in the job, the lack of how much are you being compensated for the work, the clarity around that. And if you know that you're about to hire someone that is the only one of that culture and community, what kind of support are you going to put in place? Or maybe you don't hire until you have the right person. Maybe you don't put people into place just to fill that void. I mean, I think that it calls a much larger question into place where we tend to be really quick to, we got to get these people, we got to get people hired, we got to get people in that space. And it ends up making the role worse, and our students are the ones that are on the receiving end of the result of that.
I want to jump in for just 1 second, and I want to acknowledge the breath that Khalida needed to take before she calmly answered that last question. One of the things that needs to happen is that we just need to try harder. We just need to do it. My organization is stunning me in its transformation in the last 3 weeks. When we started, and I'm telling you, it's a pretty white organization, but they started a diversity wing of the board about 5 years ago. At that time, I think we had one or maybe 2 board members of the whole organization of our people of color. And this is a large presenting organization in the Midwest. And they made a commitment to change that within the board, and they did. And it's a very diverse board now. But the language just a couple years ago was just that we want to hire a more diverse group of folks here, but it's just so hard to get people of color to apply for these positions. One of the things that was mentioned was the distance. We're in a suburb north of Chicago, and it's not a suburb that's populated by a large group of people of color. So folks don't want to travel up here. We've been putting the postings out. We're not getting a lot of applicants of color. When I say that language has completely changed, as of an hour ago, the other meeting I was just on, where everyone is like, all of the white people are like, that's bullshit. We need to do better. We're going to hold places for people of color at this level, this level, this level, and this level. And now we have placeholders for people of color on the board. And now they're talking about doing that for the staff, or at least for the final 3 applicants, et cetera. It has changed that quickly to a commitment to make that happen. And then in order to make that happen, we're going to have to expand our sources and build new relationships. But the fact that it's not anymore a discussion of how hard it is, but the fact that it's a discussion of we just have to do this is a completely new starting point.
Thank you, Christine. Any other comments, Kalita?
Um, I'm happy for y'all, Christine, and I appreciate that you recognize that moment that I needed to take, because always what sits in the back of my mind every day now, since we've all been physically isolated, but we've still been socializing virtually. But what has been sitting in the back of my mind is, why now? What's the difference? Like, why now can we find ways to be inclusive of Black and brown people? Why now are leaders of color available? It's like a pop-up party. And that just, it sits on the stem of my brain. And then sometimes it pushes too hard and I get so mad, and it's just not, it's not professional. So I had to get myself together for this call today, because I'm like, well, why are we celebrating folks now? I mean, this is what should have been happening from the beginning. It should not take loss of life for us to shift our lens and shift our language and, oh, I'm doing the work, or, oh, I've read this book, or we're going to play all African American music for a year. I'm not here for it. Okay. I'm like, great. I'm glad. But then what are you going to dismantle? Are you going to step down from that leadership position you've held? Are you going to elevate a person of color's voice and allow them to lead, and you and follow? Is that ever going to be a thing? Like, is that going to be okay? So I appreciate that Christine said that, and that those changes are happening, but that literally just sits in the back of my head, Raja, all the time. Why now? Why is it a thing now?
Yeah, no, I understand. And I think that, you know, this is something that I've studied for a while, and it's just, sometimes I have to say that it's overwhelming in different ways. I think because I'm hearing it from different people, and for some people, again, it's very new to them, right? In terms of the concepts, ideas, and the reality that this is what people have experienced. And I think Christine touched on this early on when she mentioned the microaggressions. So there are those huge, big things that are gross that we see in front of us, and then there are those everyday little pricks that happen in different spaces and places, and in a chronic way. You know, my mother and I had a conversation about this this week, in terms of kind of looking at, like, you know, again, there's more that's coming out now. You know, this has been studied, you know, at length and for years in public health and in areas of sociology. Racism is a public health concern. We can even look at racism as, you know, almost as a cancer, right? So is it, you know, throughout the body, or is it in one area? Is it concentrated? And sometimes those big pieces are kind of concentrated that you see, but for a lot of us, it's throughout the entire system, because it spreads. And it's not just at work, it's not just at school, it's when you go home, it's when you go to the grocery store, it's when you have to go speak to the principal at your child's school because your child's not being treated fairly. So it definitely is a, you know, I think that people do question the why now. I was listening to Ava DuVernay recently, and she did question, you know, that in some ways, you know, whether, you know, at least she stated that it did feel it sometimes disingenuous, you know, but I think that we have to dig deep in the other side of this. So too is recognizing that awareness is going to be different for different people. I've also had other conversations in terms of, you know, where we are at this moment. On one hand, you know, just everything happening at once. People are home, you know, for the most part. People are not going about their lives, even though, you know, I think a lot of people want to. But, you know, having that time to kind of sit where you're actually forced, you're watching and you saw what happened, your children saw what happened, and recognizing that something would have to be done about this at this moment. So I think that this is critical, and all these things, you know, we should discuss if we're going to be honest about this conversation and where we are in this moment. So I think at this time we're about 40 minutes until we're ending today. And Kalita, please help me to figure out where we're at. I think that we do want to open it up to questions that have come in at this time. Ian, I want to check in with you to see if you've noted some questions that are actually, I see that the screen's flashing a little bit. No, this is great. Okay, so Ian, if there are some questions that have come in that we via chat that we should speak to.
Yep. So got a question from Michael Jones. He was asking, how do you go about finding a consultant to work with your organization in that inclusive manner?
Kalita, do you want to take that one? to start with? Okay, I'll start. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I'll start. I believe Christine said that there is a link, a resource on the El Sistema's website. Is that correct, Katie? Do you have resources?
Yes, we have been collecting them. Monique and Hillary have been leading this effort through the Equity Centered Pedagogy Working Group. And I think actually could jump in and describe those resources now and how we're going to present them.
Hi everyone, so I'll just jump in and say, so we've been actively collecting resources, whether it's from the Equity Centered Working Group, from colleagues and friends. I put out a Facebook post. So if you have any resources, feel free to share them in the chat box or even just personally chat me and I'll put it into the resource. These resources are everywhere from podcasts to books and literature to storybooks to how do you sort of progressively unpack whitening. And how do we be allies? And so there's a lot of, there's actually resource lists within the list. We do not have consultants on this list at this point. So I think that's something we still need to look into. So Katie, I invite you to speak to that, but there's all sorts of things on this list and we'll say it will be a Google Doc and we'll share it on the website real soon, hopefully today or tomorrow. Thanks everyone.
I think that's an example of a great idea that's coming from this session. Thank you for recommending it.
That sounds fantastic. Ian, are there other questions that you see there that you'd like to highlight?
Yes, I'm seeing another one here from Collective Conservatory asking about essentially what's our best model for helping to create equity, discussing how the current symphonic model with one person making the repertoire and interpretation decisions, that being a possibly problematic model through playing predominantly white, male, Western, European composers.
So Kalita is just joining back in, and this is a question I would actually pass over to Kalita. And can I ask that you at least maybe at a high level, just kind of repeat parts of this question. Kalita, are you back with us?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, no worries. And I apologize. Do you mind repeating part of this question? I think this is a good question for Kalita and of course other musicians on the line.
Right, of course. So this question was highlighting that the current symphonic model is a bit problematic with one person making the repertoire and interpretation decisions. And playing predominantly white, male, Western composers. So the question was, what's our best model here for helping to create equity?
Well, that conversation needs to be a collective conversation, right? Like we can't, it's certainly not going to happen here. And, you know, I applaud the League of American Orchestras for trying to start that conversation. And, but I think until the majority of symphonic institutions across this country decenter their thought process about how music should be programmed for their orchestras and their ensembles, there has to be more people at the table that don't look like the homogeneous group. Like it can't, and I've heard often that, oh, well, we've really diversified our programming. Y'all haven't played nothing by Black people since I've been here. So let's talk about that. You know, like there has to be more voices. There cannot be one person making the decision. I think it needs to be a shared platform of decision making. And I actually think perhaps the model of orchestral performances, it doesn't need to be destroyed, so don't have any heart attacks on this call. I'm not saying we need to destroy it, but we may need to retool it a little bit and make it more inclusive and open, even if you're scared that there might be patrons with money who are like, oh, how dare you take away, you know, the Beethoven's 200th anniversary death concert. Like that is so, I'm offended. Well, you know what? There are other composers that are alive that are making amazing music that should be celebrated. There are other composers that have passed on that were alive before Mozart, before Beethoven, before Bach, that look like me and many people on this call whose voices are silenced, dead. And I think orchestras have the opportunity right now, today, to change that, to change their programming, to celebrate those voices. It's not cultural appropriation because we're celebrating it. We're validating those women whose music is rarely played because it doesn't fit the model that has been built on the European principles of classical music. So there has to be more people at the table, and the ones that are leading the conversation have to be willing to pass the leadership to someone else.
Fantastic. I see Maria Zorro's lots of thumbs up. And Samantha Lane, did you wanted to comment?
I did. Hi, Samantha Lane, she, her, hers. I'm my Cincinnati's development director. So I'm neither a teacher nor an artist, so you'll have to excuse me there. But our process is one in which we collaborate as staff and teachers to discuss repertoire decisions. We have a student council who have a say in what they learn and what they perform. And we have an artist in residence program that, some of it is in partnership with Carnegie Hall, but we are able to bring in international artists as well as local artists from our neighborhood in Cincinnati, which is Price Hill. And, of course, compensate them, which, remember, we compensate everyone for their labor. We pay our students when they perform at events for us. Compensating Black people for their emotional and intellectual labor matters. I don't think that necessarily goes without saying. You shouldn't be asking Black people in your community necessarily to volunteer to do this kind of work. But it allows our students who are predominantly Black and Latinx to engage with people who they know, who they respect, and who share their cultural, ethnic, and national backgrounds. To create collaborative work to share with our community. This summer, of course, we're doing everything online, but we usually do it throughout the year. And in the summer, our work intensifies and then culminates in a free festival that anyone in our community may attend. But I, besides the repertoire question, I did also just want to give everyone just a thought to chew on, which is, I've been involved in quite a few of these conversations over the years, and I find that it's very rare that they're centered around what Black people can take away from them. And I would have everyone who organized this call ask yourself, did the Black people on the call learn anything new? I know that racism is real. I know that our children need representation. I know what the violence does. I know what watching a snuff video of someone who looks like your father does to your spirit. And I'm not particularly interested in instructing white people at this point in what that does, what that means, and how they need to fix it. And so I wanted to wait and have that say, and I'm sorry if I'm taking up too much time, but it truly matters, I think, to say, hey, if this is going to be a thing so white people can try to catch up, that's fine. But I'd like it if we could elevate the level to, let's meet the most radical and revolutionary people in our community where they are and push forward from there.
Kalita, any thoughts, comments there? I thank you so much, Samantha, for all of what you said. And I think that what you added was critical. In doing this work and in teaching race and racism, this is something that I think about and I process all the time. And these are questions that students of color And I'm saying students of color, meaning students of non-white students, bring to me all the time. And what does it mean for people of color? What does it mean for Asian students? What does it mean for Black students who are disenfranchised and Latinx students who are disenfranchised? Because the messagings and the need, I would say, for people who understand and who know that this happens because it's the reality of their lives, are different. I know that when I'm teaching about racism and the impacts on the body, as a Black person, teaching that I have to breathe first, because sometimes it can be a situation where I'm experiencing at the very moment. I've received an email, from a coworker or, a chair or a dean that is latent, and I have to go and teach this. So I want to acknowledge, I don't have a quick answer for you, but one of the answers that I do speak to as well in terms of getting the work done. In some of the trainings, and I think that many people have probably gone through different levels of trainings, but sometimes what is helpful though too is actually having affinity spaces where people do different work in those spaces. It can be a matter of having certain level of awareness and even addressing certain feelings that emerge when someone is white and they see this happening, as opposed to someone who is Black and seeing this happening, someone who is Asian seeing this happening, etc. And I think I've been very fortunate to have conversations with people of different racial ethnic groups about some work that's being done in different communities. One of the things I love this, the part that you alluded to, Samantha, in terms of where people are, who are the most revolutionary of communities, and what their work is and what people should be doing. I think that people have different work to do. I think that everyone's work is important at this moment for sure. And I think it's a matter of trying to figure out what that work is. For some people, it may be the work of healing, and I think that that's critical, particularly for people of color and Black people, because this is an ongoing, and at this time, I mean, we're dealing with racism, and we're always dealing with racism, but always dealing with health inequities. But what we're seeing in the midst of this pandemic is that it's so opportunistic, so that those insults that have always been there due to racism, because health inequities are not just there because people just choose to eat bad. They're there because of systemic racism, that it's opportunistic. So particularly at a time like this, I think it's imperative for people, while there is this ongoing awareness, it's also traumatizing and re-traumatizing, I think, for people of color to engage in discussions like this over and over and over and over again. So people are extremely exhausted. And there's a lot of pain there that people are revisiting, and people always don't have a space to go to be able to address and to deal with that pain. So I do believe that it's essential for people to actually have access to healing spaces, and there is a resource, and it's actually for people of color. I know that my organization, Chair Institute, is beginning to engage in this process, whereas I do a lot of DEI work and I work with institutions, but the other side of my work is I actually work with communities and communities around health. And part of that health work actually has to do with the healing spaces. So there's the Association of Black Psychologists. They work with a group called Community Healing Network. And part of the work is to do just that, to actually help people to heal from experiences of racism. We know this is an ongoing, process, because it's before we're born, people are experiencing the impact of racism on their lives and on their bodies, and it's generational and multi-generational. So I just want to put that out there, and I want to acknowledge that because it is so critical. I think that our needs are still different, at this point in time. And this really speaks to what equity is, right? So equity is not giving everyone the same thing. It's really speaking to the needs that people have based on where they are. And I think that's just so, important that you acknowledge that, because we don't speak to that enough in conversations like this.
Yes, I second, third, fourth that, Samantha. Thank you for saying that. I'm going to be real transparent with y'all on this call. This work is so painful. I did not wake up today excited to hop on this call. And I do this work, and I do it because I love people, and I want to love the good parts of everybody. But sometimes it's real hard to love that when those micro and macro things come out in them, in writing and emails and text messages and conversations. And I've had a standing headache for weeks because of a lot of the situations that have happened around our country. And you're right, Samantha. Why are Black and brown people getting on calls, and what are we supposed to be, packing up in our nice toolkit and going back to our situation? And so that's a call to action for organizations. When you decide to bring Black and brown people of color into your organization, be sure there's space for support. Be sure there's opportunity for them to have flexible leave so that they can take a minute and regroup before they jump back into the pond, into the wild, because this is not going to happen overnight. Like, nobody should leave this call today like, "Whew, okay, I can check that off. Did that today. Well, okay, what's next?" This is not that kind of situation. This is a lifelong journey until you take your last breath on this earth. Because for us, it's been a lifelong journey since we took our first breath on this earth. And we continue to speak out for our families, for our kids, for everyone. We consider everyone family. That's the nature of the culture. We doing it for the culture. We love everybody. We see everybody, but rarely are we seen, and rarely is our pain acknowledged and validated. Like there's some videos that are going around where someone was talking about Black people don't feel pain, and I was like, what? But that is a mindset. I have experienced things in the medical profession where I've talked to my doctor and said, this is not okay. And they're like, "Oh, it's okay. Like, it's fine. You're fine." I'm not fine. I am so scared to be pregnant and carry kids. Like, I told my boyfriend, who will probably get married, I said, "Listen, if that happens, you can't work, because I'm gonna need you to go to every doctor's appointment. I'm gonna need you to hear every conversation, every question. This is real. Like, I need everybody on this call should feel discomfort. You might need to go cry a little bit, because this is real. This is the kind of anxiety that just sits and festers every day. This is not to make it a victim, but this is to show you that is what is happening as we also do the work of equity and planning for organizations and serving our own community and standing on the front lines for our men and women and Indigenous people and binary people who are losing their lives in silence. Like, all of that is looped into this. I don't want anyone walking away like, "Okay, I feel better now. I have my anti-racism resources. I have my books. I've got my dictionaries. I've got my vocab." No, nothing matters if you're not doing anything about it.
I think it's, I'm sorry, Raja, I think it's real important when you go back to your organizations and have your own listening sessions, that you leave time for Black people and people of color, of all marginalized groups, to share their stories. This is something that has been really poignant for us. It's been very important, and it has not just been led by me. It was my team that suggested, my staff suggested we have these listening sessions for our instructors and teachers and kids. And we're pretty kid-centered. So we had a couple of we have El Sistema inspired programs, we have jazz programs, we have music integration in classroom programs. So we had these different programs, and we had families come together for listening sessions. But before the jazz family listening session, we just had a meeting with our jazz instructors, our eight or so jazz instructors, a regular business meeting. And one of the instructors said, "I know we're having this listening session with the families on Saturday, but are you going to have a listening session with just us? Because there's some things that have happened to me, some things that I want to express that I may not want to convey to the kids." And so that meeting turned into a 2-hour listening session. And we heard from their eight jazz mentors, and there are 3 African, Bobby, Ernie, Perez, okay, 3 African American men who are jazz mentors, and then myself as an African American woman, a Jamaican American woman. And when the story started to come out from people, that's when I feel like the real learning took place. So I told a story of just after I'd had my baby, I went to a jazz rehearsal, And then I went to a Target in downtown Chicago I had never been to, and went through the checkout, got diapers. They put the Target stripe over the diapers. I had my bags and in my cart, and I'm leaving the Target. And I was stopped by a security guard and asked for my receipt. And I have never, in all the Targets I've ever been to, stopped and asked for my receipt. And I was flustered. I had already put the receipt away. And the tape was on the diaper box. How was I going to get the tape to put on the diaper box if I hadn't gone through the line and paid for my things? And I had just been pregnant, so I was very emotional. And I was profiled. I was, because there were lots of people that went through that weren't checked in this way. And I got so, and then the reason it came up in this discussion was I was trying to describe the anger, the feeling that Black people carry with them. They don't always remember they have it, but then it just comes out because these things happen to us, to every single one of us, it's a tiny thing or a big thing. I was so mad that my voice was 10 times louder than it ever has been. My voice went from the front of the Target to the back of the Target. And I said, I want to see a manager. I want to see a manager right now. Everybody turned around. Everyone saw what was happening, but I was the one that was feeling it. Oh, I just shook my camera. See the feeling. And I had forgotten that experience until this conversation came up. And I didn't start to cry in telling that story. But when Ernie Adams, who is one of the best percussionists in the country, of African American and Filipino heritage, after I told my story, he said, you know, Christine, that's what it sets up, is that we always have to present ourselves as not a threat. We always have to, he's like, I always wear my jacket. I always dress up more just to go anywhere. I'm not going to go to that restaurant in shorts and flip-flops because I have to present myself as someone who is not a threat. And so we have to dress a certain way and act a certain way as to not be a threat to the white public. And if not, we run the risk of being profiled or being treated differently. And in having that conversation, you know, then another one of our mentors, a white man, said, you know, I hadn't thought about it until I was on tour with a couple of Black musicians, and the three of us went into a restaurant that, what is it, Cracker Barrel. And the host was talking to us. And then we sat down and my two Black colleagues were laughing. And I said, what's going on? And they said, oh, like the way she only addressed you. And he said, oh, you know, and since then he became more aware, and actually it was a running joke because different places they went to on this tour, that happened. So these stories that are coming from our instructors, from our students, are really, I think, informing everybody, but also allowing those of us who have had these experiences to share with you all that this is what we go through, whether it's once every 10 years or every other week. All three of those jazz mentors, African-American jazz mentors, had been at some point as adults stopped, not just stopped, come out of the car, hands up, and checked. Why? Because, and this didn't come from me, this came from them, because they matched a description. That's all of my jazz mentors. All of my Black jazz mentors had gone through that. And so having these stories and all of us together, and again, everybody felt like it was a place of trust. And this is not going to be the only time we have that dialogue. We're going to continue these dialogues. But I think it's real important to hear each other's stories of struggle, and not just Black people. You know, there's where have you been the other? Where have you been marginalized? How has that hurt you? How has that strengthened you? And what advice do you have to give to people? And how do we all recognize this, that this is going on, so that we don't make those mistakes moving forward? So this storytelling is going to be real important.
Thank you so much, Christine. And I think that's so important. And that really gets to, I think, the heart of this, and really the impact in terms of the experiences that people have with racism. And I think that these are stories that we often don't tell and we don't share. And I just want to add to this as well. And I think this kind of goes back to what Samantha said, and just connecting the two, that I think for people of color, there's almost, and I will say this, I've been writing about it, there's some shame there, though, to even when people experience racism, that we don't get to talk about, because that should not have happened. And then just the natural response, that fight or flight that people feel in terms of how to respond to it, and then questioning whether or not you responded the right way to a situation, as you described, Christine. Thank you for being vulnerable, and thank you for sharing that. I want to, I know that there are more questions and we are getting close for time. I do want to say a couple of things. I know Gwen had her hand raised. Gwen Laster, so I'm going to turn it over to you if you remember your question. I do want to also point out that there are still some questions in the chat bar. I think after Gwen speaks, Ian, if we can kind of go back to the chat bar. I know some folks are not going to probably raise their hand to speak. And then we may have to kind of begin to switch gears to move towards our close. And I think that's important though too, because a conversation like this should just not stop here. This is the beginning. And I think that Katie would probably like to speak to that in terms of the effort to continue to have conversations and have spaces like this for us to have conversations as we're having today. So I'm going to turn it over to Gwen, then afterwards I'll turn it over to Ian.
Thanks so much. I'm Gwen Laster. I'm in New York. My group is called Creative Strings Improvisers Orchestra. I just want to tag on to Samantha and Kalita with transparency. And it's true that even thinking about this meeting today, I was thinking about how much bandwidth I had to even get into a conversation about race again, and about racism, and about how we grew up, and about how we feel. And particularly, and Kalita, I know you can connect with this because you're a violinist, coming up with this classical training, and the separatism of the music. And so I have to say that I feel particularly comfortable and at home with the idea that El Sistema is welcoming cultural diversity through music. I mean, you realize that there should be no separatism in everybody learning all kinds of music. And Kalita, you brought up a good point that even improvisers and jazz players should be learning more about classical. So the whole idea of why is music the thing? Music is the thing because it's the unifier of cultures. And I think that I saw a little blurb and all this that we read these days over the past 3 months since we've been sheltered in. I saw something about ASTA, American String Teachers Association, and how they were not so open to receive these different kinds of music, and the Suzuki Association. So these people there are lots of people and lots of huge organizations who are educational organizations that have this big influence over students that are still not taking in this whole idea of music and how important it is to study different kinds of music from all over the world. And I posted a little question earlier about, I'm intrigued why we, as being the indigenous country of improvised music, why that's so difficult to acknowledge and embrace that and easily put that into our curriculums. I mean, we don't have a problem. We don't miss a beat when it comes to studying Mozart, to studying everything that's European. It's justified. It's on a high level. But when it comes to the music that comes from our country, we have a little bit of a problem with that. So I'm happy that in El Sistema we are addressing that, and that we are embracing that idea of all music as being very valid and no separatism with that, because that is what racism is all about. It's about this ignorance of other cultures and not acknowledging and understanding that other systems are valid and that are challenging and are sophisticated, as somebody said earlier about classical music. It's sophisticated. There are tons of genres of music that are sophisticated that we just don't even know anything about. We don't have a clue about it because we're not open enough, and we owe it to ourselves to learn more and more about that so that we can educate young people and so that generations forward can begin to dismantle this systemic racism. And it's not going to happen by November 6th because this has been going on for centuries. So for me, I'm hoping the protesting goes on and on and on and on. And Samantha, you mentioned something about being revolutionary. You know, I'm like, let's keep protesting until we get exactly what we want at least, and then more. Let's go from there. So that's my thought, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy that you guys let me speak because there's a lot of people here today. So thank you, everybody. Christine, Kalita, everybody, Dr. Staggers. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. And Kalita, I was going to turn it over. Do you want to comment? And then we'll turn it over to Ian. I wasn't sure.
No, well, technically I was breathing. But I also just wanted to say, if you should be all ready now and poised to do the work. So I hope that you all start filling out grant applications for EDI work. I like to move the letters around: equity, diversity, and inclusion, and get some money in your budgets and start bringing in consultants to help you be better. Our kids deserve so much better than what we're giving them right now. And we all on this call know what the right now looks like, and it's not pretty and it's shameful. So that was my comment. I didn't know if we were closing out right this second, Raja.
We may need to actually switch gears and probably close out because we are about 5 minutes before the time allocated to end the call today. Are you all comfortable with switching gears, Kalita, Katie?
Yeah, I think
okay. Okay, so do we want to move, Katie, do you want to speak a little bit about next steps and then we'll close out? Is that okay? And now I know that there are still questions that have come through, so maybe we can take a look at some of those questions at some point. Katie, okay, that we did not get to address. All right.
Yes, just want to reiterate, as I think we've heard several times today, this is the beginning of conversation that we want to have as part of the ongoing culture of El Sistema USA. Christine shared, I think in her comments, maybe not today, but yeah, today, that these are, I think we have found one another's people. I am just so grateful to be part of this community and to know that we as a community in our ethos want to learn and share from one another and continue to help one another improve and do better, always with the core focus of our kids. And the resources that will be available from this meeting include the recordings and the notes from this meeting, and also the great work of the Equity Centered Pedagogy working group. I would encourage everyone to join that. It is wide open for participation. Also, Kalita is the chair of our Racial Diversity and Cultural Understanding Committee of the board. We're going to have a good deal of work coming out of that group. As Monique shared, the strategic plan of El Sistema USA for the next 5 years is to strategically focus on the intersection of musical excellence and equity. I am certain that that focus will continue long into our future. One of the things that we've spoken about in terms of direct next steps for El Sistema USA is rethinking what it means to be a member of El Sistema USA and beginning to include the words of equity and inclusion and anti-racism in the criteria for membership in El Sistema USA. So I just want to put that out there now to this group to know that that's something that we're looking at including immediately. Following this conversation, we hope this to be just the beginning of many conversations. So please expect to hear from us. Please hold us accountable And please expect to hear from us for continuing this conversation and to taking the ideas and questions that we didn't get to future conversations and to incorporating some of these great ideas into our work. I just want to say thank you. I feel very humbled. Kalita, yes.
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, yes, hold us accountable, but be sure that when you start putting out well, what are you all doing? What are your next steps? Make sure you check your own steps first, because I'm seeing a lot of that starting to happen right now. And I think people just have a lot of energy and emotions around it. It's like, I want to see your itemized list. I want to see your itemized list, you know? So there has to be some space, because this call was hard for every single person that was on it, because it calls out things that you weren't prepared to be called out. And there needs to be validation for processing to occur, and for some real thoughtful, intentional action that you're going to do personally. We got it from here. I've been checking it since December 9th, 1981. So just know, check your stuff before you start checking other people's noses. Okay, I'm done.
And we are an association of ourselves. So please join the work of El Sistema USA. We're electing new board members in this December, and our board is elected by the membership. So please think about it. Think about joining our committee. Think about joining in this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Raja, go ahead.
Yeah, and I just want to just emphasize as well too that there's work for everyone at this moment. So I think that wherever you are, wherever you stand, where you sit, and where you have influence, please use that space to do work, because everyone has work to do in this moment. So you're needed here. Thank you.
I wanted to thank Katie for her tremendous leadership of El Sistema USA, and for bringing it along to where we can have these national conversations that are so great. I want to thank all the members of our board for continuing to fight for us to be better as a board, as an organization, and as a movement. And I especially want to thank Kalita Jones and Dr. Raja Staggers Hakim for facilitating this conversation today, and for continuing to facilitate great conversations in the future. We also have the forum that Monique and Hillary have been leading, and those are just great resources for us that already exist. So thank you all for taking the time to be in this conversation, but really thanks to our facilitators today. This was tremendous.
Thanks for having us. It's hard work, but we have to all lift each other up in the process, no matter how uncomfortable you feel. So this was step -99. Okay, we are not at step 0 yet. We're at step -99. We were able to have the conversation. So now you go and we get to step 0. So this is not over. This conversation is not over. I hope you will encourage your teaching artists, your board members, especially if your board looks questionable. Get them on these next conversations that we have so they can learn how to be better. Because this doesn't mean anything if it's just the 70 or 80 of us, because you're going to be fighting to deaf ears. So be sure to extend your arms of invitation to these conversations so that we can work together to build a more productive environment for our kids.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to sign off. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.